everyone. So today I'm going to tell 3 stories of transformation. And they have different protagonists, but they're essentially the same. And the first story I want to tell is my own. I grew up in New York, the youngest of 3 sisters, and one of the greatest gifts that our parents gave us was instilling in us in a young age a love for nature. Every summer, we'd go camping in Maine for weeks at a time, and my mother would place me down on the ground. And as my senses were forming, I was taking in the sweet smell of the pine needle floor, the towering trees above me and the squirrels scampering in the branches, and that haunting sound of the loon echoing off the lake. I remember my mother would take me out in the canoe, and I could barely lift the oar, but the feeling of peace and putting that oar into the water, feeling so strong and yet so held. As a child, I spent a lot of time in nature. My family loves to tell a story about how in school I had learned that compost actually generates heat. And so little Melinda went home, my parents looked out the window, and they found me in the dead of winter. I dug a hole in our big, giant compost pile, and I was happily sitting in the warmth of decomposing leaves. If you asked me as a teenager if I would have started a women's organization, I would have been very surprised. I certainly didn't consider myself a feminist. I remember my older sister's friends were feminists, and I always thought it made them kind of grumpy. But I could tell you that my best education was on those sports teams. The feeling of moving across the field with a team of girls, feeling our collective power. And so I had a pretty good childhood. I grew up feeling strong, secure, confident. When I was 18 years old, I was just weeks away from graduating high school. Everything changed. I can remember the moment. I was sitting in biology class, thinking about everything other than biology, when the school guidance counselor called me out of the classroom. And she said, "Melinda, something has happened to your sister." I said, "Is she alive?" They said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, she's alive. She's safe. Your parents would like to tell you what happened." And when I drove home, my parents shared with me something terrible had happened to my sister. She was out on a run in Vermont where she lived, and she was attacked by a man, and she was kidnapped. And for many hours, she endured terrible things. There was another part to that story that I learned, that this wasn't just a tragedy. This was a hero's journey. He had a gun, and he was going to kill my sister. And in that moment, she had the presence of mind to see his humanity. And she reached across and she built a bridge. She spoke to him, and she said, "You're not a monster." And she convinced him to drive her home and let her go. Within hours, she had called the police. She had given a detailed police report, and he was arrested within just a few hours. Today, my sister is healthy and well. She has 3 beautiful children. And although my sister was safe, I left for college feeling anything but safe. I was scared of everything. And for 2 years, this is how I lived. Paralyzed with fear, numb. And yet I could feel myself in there. I gravitated towards anything that could let me feel myself, feel life pulsing through me again. I've discovered a love for the continent of Africa. I started doing African dance class, learning Swahili. I fell in love with anthropology and the study of cultures. But I was scared. I knew I needed to step into the world. That's where my compass was pointing. I remember my mother came out for a visit. We were on another canoe together. It was slightly a different scene because we were in the middle of an urban center in a tiny little man-made lake, but nevertheless, I told her that I wanted to enroll in this anthropology program in Nairobi and travel around Kenya. And she said to me, "Why don't you just take the step?" And that's what I did. Not because I wasn't scared, because I had learned from my sister that I didn't have to be a victim to fear. Like she did, I could choose life. I took that step, and it took me onto a plane to Nairobi. We were arriving in the morning, and I pulled up the windows, and I saw the sun rising over the peaks of Mount Kilimanjaro. And in that moment, I felt a wash over of a yes. My healing journey had begun. And what did I discover? I felt the full spectrum of the human experience in my time in Kenya, from the depths of pain and scarcity to the peaks of joy and abundance. This is Esther. Esther was 19 when I met her. She was my sister in my homestay where I lived. She was already the mother of 2. And Esther had to drop out of school very young because she was the one in her family who needed to gather the water every day. And every day, Esther would walk 4 hours to fetch water, carrying 40 pounds of it back on her head. She cared for her parents. She cared for her husband's parents. She did the cooking. She tended to the farm. She was the first to wake. She was the last to sleep. And everything she did was with a smile. She never complained. She was the one that people came to for guidance, for support. And what I would learn during my time was that Esther was like millions of women around the world who are the absolute bedrock of our families, of our communities, who do what's needed when it's needed. I would learn that women in sub-Saharan Africa are spending 40 billion hours a year walking to fetch water, because that's their role. That most of the world's food is produced by women, and yet they're only owning 1% of the world's tidal land, doing what needs to be done. And I knew that this was nothing new, that these women were a part of an age-old tradition, right, of women stewarding our communities, stewarding our land, our water, our food, protecting our children, our future generations, not as a 9-to-5 job, but because this is our responsibility. This has been our responsibility. Everything stemmed from communities having their basic needs met: access to clean water, healthy food, safe land. And if communities didn't have these things, it seemed to me impossible that they could address anything else that was important to them: education, political stability, economic growth. And at the core of these issues, these basic human rights, women stood, holding the burden, but also holding the opportunity. There was something here. I could feel it. It was that stirring in my soul that there was this connection, and it was so important at this time between women and the environment. And I wanted to understand it, and so I took 6 years working for environmental organizations all over the world, from East Africa to Russian Far East, to China, to the Arctic, to Latin America. And everywhere I went, I saw women at the forefront, launching campaigns, building coalitions, protecting their rivers, protecting their forests, protecting their children from pollutants and toxicity. And I saw so many different cultures, so many different lifestyles, and a very strong thread of qualities that women were bringing that I found were not only unique, but essential. Resourcefulness. Because so many of the women who I worked with didn't have access to the many things that they needed to assist their work, they were strategic, working with what they had, building from the strengths of their communities. Of course, we know women were collaborative. No one was trying to do it alone because it wasn't going to work. Building alliances, building bridges as a way towards solution. I remember I was in a press conference. A community was coming together to fight a lead smelter that had been polluting illegally their community for decades. And one woman stood up and she said, "I am not an environmentalist. I'm not a politician. I'm not a scientist. I'm a mother. And I have a community to take care of and future generations." And there was no one in that room that could say, "Well, that's good, but that's not my issue." And that's what women were bringing. Anytime I heard them open their mouth, it wasn't about silos. I'm an environmentalist over here. I'm a politician over here. It was about being holistic. It was about common sense. I also saw the same challenges. Wherever I went, I heard women express their frustration for doing this work without the support that they needed. Access to resources, information, training, the support of other women. I can't tell you how many times I heard women say to me, "I'm doing this work and I feel so alone." I would see women coming up with the same solutions across the world from each other, having no idea that each other existed. They didn't know they weren't alone. And so I began to wonder, what would it look like if women doing this life-affirming work of sustaining and protecting our communities were supported and united? And so I joined together with advisors and colleagues, and we together asked this question. We asked it loud and we asked it far. And we knew to get the answer, we would need to bring together women who are on the front lines of these challenges, living them every day of their lives. We decided we would hold a visioning session, bringing together women from around the world to help answer this question. We put out a call for nominations far and wide. We received applicants from all over the world, and we selected 30 women from 26 countries with a range of ethnicity and ages. The youngest was 26, the oldest was 82, and we were ready to go. And I knew I needed to fully commit myself to this work and quit my job and go for it. And I was scared. But once again, I took that step because I thought about my sister, and if she had waited for someone to tap her on the shoulder and invite her to act, she wouldn't be here today. I thought about the incredible women who I'd come across in my journeys. If they had waited for the experts to come and design the solutions, if they had waited for the proper credentials, the solutions that they had generated would never come to be. And so once again, I took that step. And this time, it was on a plane to Mexico City, which is where we would be gathering. The first circle, when these 30 women came together, is a peak life experience for me. There we were, standing together, such different lives, but looking out and seeing reflections of each other. I looked over at Kaisha Atakanova from Kazakhstan. Kaisha's country was dealing with a 40-year legacy of nuclear testing with astronomical levels of cancer and birth defects. Kaisha had launched a national campaign to stop nuclear waste from being commercially imported into her country. I looked across and I saw Sizani Ngubani from South Africa, who was working in a community that was so poor and stripped of its natural resources, so food insecure that women were having to feed their children clay. Sizani had built the Rural Women's Movement, 500 women's groups, providing these women with support and training. There was one moment, as we were standing there, silent, holding hands, and one woman said, "I've traveled thousands of miles to be here, and I finally feel that I'm home." That moment said it all, because home is where you are safe, where you are secure, where you can source yourself. That circle would be the first of many. And so out of this collaborative blueprint that we built, the Women's Earth Alliance was born. And every day, we work to answer that question of what would the world look like if women protecting the earth were supported and united. We identify women leaders in some of the most underserved and environmentally threatened parts of the world, and we support their leadership because we know these women have the answers. They know what they need to do. All they need is a little bit of support and connection to other leaders. The best thing we can do is listen and connect the dots. We support women with helping them access resources like training, funding, capacity building to build their leadership. We help women achieve success in their campaigns. These are the women that attended a training we supported last year in northern India. Women came together from 4 flood-affected states that are feeling the very real impacts of climate crises every day, destroying their farms, their families. Most of the farmers in India are women, and yet because they don't own land and their rights are limited, they aren't even considered as farmers. These women came to the training in teams of 2. They learned skills in sustainable agriculture, seed saving. They left that training knowing not only were they farmers, but they had something to teach. They went back into their communities with seed grants, with new ideas, with a network of support, and they trained thousands more women. They planted thousands of trees. They started organic farms across a flood-impacted area. These are the women who attended a training we supported this year in Uganda. These women are from East Africa, where there are places that are severely experiencing drought and water shortages. Although women are doing all the accessing of water, they're rarely involved in the planning and the design of water projects. Many of these women had never picked up a shovel. They hadn't been given the chance. After this training, these women knew how to build water technologies, tanks, rainwater harvesting, toilets, solar cookers. They went back into their communities with seed grants. They trained many, many women, and last year they were able to bring clean water to 15,000 people. And I can assure you, if you meet these women, they do not consider themselves victims. Not at all. They are agents of change. And so that's the second story of transformation. Not only are these women transforming themselves, but they go on to transform their husbands, their children, their governments, future generations that are yet to come. That's where I get to the third story of transformation. And I'm pretty confident that we're writing it right now in this room. Longtime environmental activist Julia Butterfly Hill once said that each time we gather, the world changes. I so believe that. I recently spoke with my co-director at a corporate women's leadership conference. And afterwards, a woman came up to me. She was a corporate CEO, and she said, I so admire what you're doing, and sometimes there's so much that I want to do, and I just feel paralyzed. I don't know what my next step will be. And as I heard her say that, I saw reflections of the many women who I'd come across on my path, from my sister, to Esther, to Kaisha, to Sizani. And I knew that just like them, she didn't know she wasn't alone, that all she had to do was take that step. And that's what she did. I just got off a conference call with her recently. She went back into her corporate community, and she's now launching a series of leadership trainings for women, where women will also pool their resources and support our East African colleagues across the world. When I look across this beautiful room of people, I know that we are transforming this world, and I know that we are inextricably linked. We are an unstoppable movement of women, transforming, rising. In her Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, my dear friend, the late Dr. Wangari Maathai said, to paraphrase, in the course of history, there comes a time when we have to shed our fear and give hope to each other. That time is now. Thank you.